In early 1942, as America prepared for global war, engineers at Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island were given an impossible order: design a portable, weatherproof, mass-producible building that could be shipped anywhere in the world, erected by untrained soldiers, and ready for use within a single day. What they created became one of the unsung symbols of Allied industrial superiority: the Quonset hut. Built from lightweight corrugated steel, with prefabricated arches and standardized panels, the Quonset hut could be assembled by 6 men in less than 24 hours using only hand tools. Every piece fit perfectly because it was manufactured to identical tolerances in American factories, already practiced in automobile and aircraft production. By the end of World War II, more than 170,000 of these structures had been built across every theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. Meanwhile, in Britain, military engineers relied on the Nissen hut, an earlier and similar design dating back to World War I. Though durable, it demanded more manual labor and specialized fitting. British reports from the Ministry of Works in 1941 noted that an average Nissen hut required up to a week to complete, largely due to shortages of standardized parts and the limits of Britain's wartime industry. The comparison was striking. The U.S. could construct a complete base in the time Britain could erect a single row of shelters. What made the Quonset hut revolutionary was not its appearance. It looked simple, even crude, but its philosophy. It embodied the American system of modular, interchangeable production. Engineers approached it as a product of logistics, not architecture. The same techniques that turned out jeeps, aircraft, and Liberty ships were applied to housing. For every component, there was a replacement ready; for every bolt, an exact copy. The result was a structure that could be shipped flat in crates, assembled in a day, disassembled in another, and reused endlessly. Captured German documents later revealed that Wehrmacht analysts were baffled by the speed of American base construction in Normandy and the Pacific. They assumed the Allies had employed massive precast concrete systems. The truth was far simpler and far more efficient. The Quonset hut was the physical expression of America's industrial mindset: reliability through repetition, efficiency through simplicity. By the time U.S. troops landed in Europe in 1944, these curved steel huts had become a symbol of American presence. They housed everything: mess halls, hospitals, offices, radio stations, even chapels. Soldiers joked that if the army could fit it in a Quonset hut, they didn't need anything else. But behind the humor lay a hard truth. This humble structure revealed the industrial gap that defined the war. The contrast between Britain's slower-to-build Nissen huts and America's one-day Quonset shelters was more than an engineering difference. It was a reflection of two nations' industrial philosophies. Britain still built by craftsmanship, America built by system. That difference, multiplied 1,000,000 times across factories, shipyards, and battlefields, would determine who could sustain a global war. By the summer of 1942, the Quonset hut had gone from sketch to mass production at a pace that stunned even American engineers. The first prototype had been drawn on a drafting table in Rhode Island in just 60 days. Within 6 months, the first 8,200 units rolled out of the George A. Fuller Construction Company assembly lines. By the following year, multiple contractors across the U.S., including Great Lakes Steel and Strand Steel, were churning out hut kits by the tens of thousands. Every element of the hut was designed for simplicity. The arch panels, made of pressed steel, could be stacked like shingles for easy transport. Each hut measured 20 by 48 feet, providing nearly 1,000 square feet of usable space. The components were shipped in flat wooden crates, and each crate came with illustrated instructions clear enough that any squad of soldiers could assemble the structure without technical supervision. It was the IKEA of war. 2 decades before IKEA existed, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, better known as the Seabees, quickly adopted the Quonset hut as their standard building. On remote Pacific islands, they used them for everything from command centers to repair shops. Some were built atop coral foundations, others directly on sand or wooden platforms. It didn't matter, the design was adaptable. One hut could become a field hospital, another a weather station, another a radio relay point. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, British engineers observed with a mix of admiration and quiet frustration. The Nissen hut, though conceptually similar, was built using less standardized components and required skilled workers to align the curved ribs manually. Even with experience, a full crew might spend days completing one. The British War Office admitted in 1943 that while Nissen huts remained valuable, they lacked the rapid deployment potential of their American counterpart. The contrast extended beyond logistics. It reflected a deeper truth about the war economies. The U.S. possessed not only immense industrial capacity but also the logistical foresight to integrate production, shipping, and assembly into a single system. Each Quonset hut could be produced in Michigan, shipped by rail to New York, loaded onto Liberty ships, and erected within 48 hours on a Pacific atoll thousands of miles away. One Navy engineer later recalled, "We didn't just build huts, we built civilization in crates." The Germans noticed, after capturing Quonset-style structures in North Africa and Italy, Wehrmacht engineers reported in disbelief that such buildings could withstand tropical heat, monsoon rain, and shell shock all without concrete. German officers, accustomed to masonry and heavy timber, could not comprehend how something so light could be so durable. By late 1943, the Quonset hut had become a logistical weapon. It gave American forces the ability to turn any stretch of land into a functioning base, almost overnight, whether it was housing aircrews in Guadalcanal, setting up supply depots in Tunisia, or creating hospitals in Normandy. The same design followed: uniform, quick, and efficient. The result was a revolution in military infrastructure. For every Sherman tank or B-17 bomber, there was a Quonset hut standing behind it, keeping men fed, healed, and coordinated. It was not glamorous, but it was indispensable, the silent skeleton of the American war machine. By early 1943, production of the Quonset hut had become a 24-hour operation. In cities like Providence, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, factories that once made automobile frames and refrigerator panels were retooled to stamp curved steel ribs for the huts. At the peak of wartime demand, more than 500 units were completed every day. Women made up nearly half the assembly line workers, performing precision metalwork with riveting guns and hydraulic presses once considered men's work. The efficiency was staggering. A full Quonset hut kit required roughly 10,000 pounds of galvanized steel, and could be produced in under 9 man-hours, a figure unheard of in Britain or Germany. Every curve, bolt, and joint was standardized to military specification, meaning spare parts from any factory fit perfectly into any hut anywhere in the world. This modular precision became one of the greatest unsung advantages of American industrial warfare. At the Navy's Davyville Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island, the birthplace of the Quonset design, entire fields were covered in newly built huts awaiting shipment. Each bore a serial number, destination code, and stencil of its contents: mess hall, barracks, medical, workshop. The logistical choreography was breathtaking. Liberty ships loaded with tanks, jeeps, and munitions would often have hundreds of hut kits stacked aboard as ballast, ensuring that wherever U.S. troops landed, they could build a functioning camp within hours. In contrast, the British Nissen hut industry was fragmented. Materials shortages forced the use of varied corrugated metals, sometimes steel, sometimes aluminum, and construction relied on regional contractors with limited standardization. Each hut, though functional, was slightly different from the next. A door built in Manchester might not fit a frame produced in Glasgow. This inconsistency frustrated Royal Engineers trying to deploy structures rapidly in North Africa and Burma. American officers visiting British sites were astonished at the delays. One British corporal reportedly quipped, "By the time we raise the roof, the Yanks have already built a town." That wasn't far from the truth. In places like Nome and Espiritu Santo, the U.S. Navy Seabees transformed raw jungle into fully operational ports, hospitals, and airfields in weeks, entirely housed in Quonset huts. A lesser-known fact is how the huts' design subtly anticipated post-war needs. The engineers at Quonset Point deliberately used materials and dimensions compatible with peacetime manufacturing. In memos from 1944, Navy architects speculated that the huts could one day serve as housing for veterans, classrooms, or even churches. They were building not just for the war, but for the world that would follow it. By late 1943, more than 100,000 huts had been shipped overseas. They dotted the deserts of North Africa, lined the coasts of Australia, and covered island chains across the Pacific like silver shells glinting in the sun. To many soldiers, the sight of a Quonset hut on the horizon meant safety, a place to eat, sleep, and write letters home. Behind every one stood an invisible army of factory workers, welders, and logistics planners who turned America's industrial potential into the most flexible military infrastructure ever seen. By 1944, The Quonset hut had become more than a structure, it was a symbol of the American way of war. It embodied the nation's philosophy that speed, standardization, and mass production could overcome any logistical challenge. This approach contrasted sharply with Britain's craftsmanship-based system, where each project reflected individual engineering expertise, rather than uniform industrial process. British engineers at the War Office were increasingly aware of the disparity. Reports from the Mediterranean theater compared the time and manpower needed to erect equivalent housing. A British Nissen hut, shipped in partial sections and requiring specialized tools, took an average of 5 to 7 days to complete with a crew of 12. An American Quonset hut, by contrast, could be unpacked, bolted, and roofed in less than 24 hours by the same number of men, even with minimal training. The difference lay not in construction skill but in philosophy. American engineers had assumed from the start that soldiers, not professional builders, would be assembling these huts under combat conditions. Everything from the curved ribs to the interlocking floor plates was designed for intuitive, mistake-proof assembly. The bolts were uniform length. The panels were numbered sequentially. Even the instruction manual, printed on waterproof paper, used simple diagrams instead of text-heavy explanations. In one report from the British 8th Army, an officer noted with some frustration that his men spent as much time interpreting blueprints as they did turning spanners. Meanwhile, American Seabees in the Pacific had turned hut building into a kind of competition. Units bragged about setting records, some completing full Quonset installations in as little as 8 hours. This industrial simplicity had cascading effects. Faster setup meant faster deployment of communications, medical, and repair facilities. In Italy, American field hospitals under Quonset roofs were operational within days of landing, treating wounded soldiers before British units nearby had finished assembling their own camp kitchens. In Burma and India, where the monsoon destroyed conventional tents, Quonset huts remained dry and intact thanks to their corrugated steel shells and raised wooden floors. At the strategic level, this reliability freed up resources. The U.S. could send fewer engineers, less construction equipment, and still outbuild its allies. In Washington, this efficiency became a point of quiet pride. A 1944 Army Corps of Engineers report stated bluntly, "The Quonset hut is not beautiful, but it wins wars." Even German intelligence took notice. In captured documents analyzed after the war, Wehrmacht officers remarked on the Americans' ability to create entire cities of steel within days. To them, the huts were proof of the Allies' overwhelming logistical superiority, evidence that they were fighting not just soldiers, but an entire industrial civilization capable of building faster than destruction could occur. By mid-1944, as the Allies prepared for the Normandy invasion, the Quonset hut's legacy was already secure. Thousands were stacked on English docks, ready to be shipped to France the moment the beaches were secured. They would soon form the skeleton of temporary air bases, field hospitals, and command posts stretching from Cherbourg to the Rhine. When the first Quonset huts arrived in Normandy after D-Day, they became an immediate symbol of Allied permanence. The beaches at Omaha, Utah, and Gold were still littered with wrecked landing craft and destroyed vehicles. When engineering battalions began assembling their first curved metal shelters, within 48 hours, supply depots, radio stations, and field hospitals were operational under the arching steel ribs of Quonset huts. To German prisoners, these half-cylindrical buildings rising amid the rubble were a shocking sign. The Americans were not merely invading, they were settling in. By July 1944, the U.S. Army's 1st Engineer Special Brigade had built over 3,000 huts in Normandy alone. Each was erected from identical kits shipped across the Atlantic and marked with unique codes. For rapid inventory, the design proved almost indestructible. When storms struck the French coast in August, canvas tents were shredded and timber huts flooded, but the Quonsets stood firm, their corrugated steel shells deflecting wind and rain as if built for the elements. British officers visiting American installations were astonished at the speed of construction. A single Quonset camp of 200 huts at St. Hel was completed in under 2 weeks, something that would have taken British Royal Engineers nearly 2 months with Nissen huts. One officer, Major Douglas Sim, wrote in his diary, "They arrive in boxes, like toys, yet stand stronger than any building we have managed to put up in this miserable weather." As the Allied armies advanced through France and into Belgium, the huts followed the front line. Each new airstrip, maintenance yard, and headquarters came to life beneath those same curved roofs. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express drivers often joked that they could tell where Yankee headquarters was just by spotting the silver arcs gleaming in the distance. Behind the front, the huts played another role: morale. Soldiers returning from the line knew they would sleep under something dry, solid, and warm. In winter 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, hundreds of Quonsets were converted into emergency medical wards, keeping wounded men alive when temperatures dropped below freezing. Logistically, the huts were a miracle. Each was light enough to be shipped on a single 2-ton truck, yet sturdy enough to withstand snow loads and artillery shock. When asked by reporters how such efficiency was possible, an Army engineer replied simply, "We stopped building buildings. We started building systems." By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany in March 1945, more than 150,000 Quonset huts had been constructed across Europe. They served every imaginable function from mess halls to radar stations, and became as familiar to American troops as their rifles and jeeps. Even after the war ended, many remained in use for years, some converted into schools, homes, and churches in the ruins of post-war Europe. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Quonset hut had already outlived the war it was built for. Across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, its unmistakable curved silhouette became part of the global landscape of recovery. In Germany and Italy, they served as refugee housing. In Japan, they sheltered American occupation troops and displaced civilians alike. What had begun as a wartime emergency structure quietly evolved into the architecture of a new era, one of rebuilding, adaptation, and resilience. American engineers who had designed the huts at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, were astonished to see how far their creation had spread. Photographs from liberated France showed entire towns made of steel arcs, lined in perfect rows. In the Philippines, naval bases used them for offices and machine shops. On Guam, entire hospitals stood beneath the same corrugated ribs that once housed field mess halls. In North Africa, the huts had become a universal solution, cheap, transportable, and indestructible. For British observers, the Quonset's success marked a painful but valuable lesson. The Nissen hut, invented during World War I, had served its purpose with distinction, but it reflected an older industrial philosophy, one of limited production, reliance on skilled labor, and improvisation. The Americans, by contrast, had weaponized standardization. Every panel, bolt, and brace was identical and interchangeable, produced by multiple manufacturers who shared blueprints and specifications. This approach, more than any single weapon, represented the United States' decisive advantage, an economy that could turn industrial science into a force multiplier. In the immediate post-war years, surplus Quonset huts flooded civilian markets. Universities from California to Massachusetts bought thousands for use as temporary classrooms. Veterans studied under those curved roofs on the G.I. Bill, learning engineering, law, and medicine inside the same type of buildings that had supported their war. In Alaska and Iceland, they became permanent homes. Even into the 1950s, the huts remained a fixture of small-town America, reminders of the nation's capacity to build, ship, and erect entire worlds from steel and willpower. Historically, their significance was deeper than utility. The Quonset hut symbolized an ideological triumph, that democracy, through organization and ingenuity, could outproduce tyranny. Where Germany had built tanks that broke after a few hundred miles, America had built buildings that could rise in a single day. Where Britain had cherished craftsmanship, the United States had perfected process. Today, thousands of Quonset huts still stand, on farms, in industrial parks, on old airfields reclaimed by nature. Rusted, patched, but unbroken, they endure as silent monuments to a time when the strength of a nation was measured, not only in firepower, but in the humble, efficient geometry of its design. By 1946, the Quonset hut had become more than a wartime artifact. It was the blueprint for America's new global reach. In Europe, they formed the backbone of the Marshall Plan's reconstruction projects, serving as storage depots, offices, and housing for engineers rebuilding bombed cities. In the Pacific, they became command centers for U.S. occupation forces in Japan and Korea, housing both soldiers and diplomats in austere yet efficient comfort. The huts were easy to forget, and that was precisely their power. They were not monuments but tools, invisible in their practicality. Each arch of steel represented the principles that had defined American wartime production: modularity, speed, and scale. No nation in history had ever produced so much, so quickly, with so few resources wasted. German economists studying post-war logistics later described the Quonset hut as the small cell of a giant organism, each identical, but collectively unstoppable. At home, America used its surplus huts to absorb the post-war boom. Veterans returning from Europe found familiar corrugated roofs at universities, where Quonset villages sprang up to house married students. The University of Minnesota, Stanford, and Harvard all built hundreds of these structures, painting them white and adding windows for comfort. What had once been a temporary barracks for combat engineers became classrooms for physicists and architects designing the modern world. Culturally, the Quonset hut came to represent a quiet kind of triumph. It lacked the glamour of the atomic bomb or the mystique of the jet engine, but it embodied something far more durable, the idea that organization and design could win wars and build peace. Reporters writing in 1947 called them America's silent soldier structures that conquered the elements instead of enemies. The British, meanwhile, recognized the irony. Their own Nissen hut, the Quonset's predecessor, had laid the groundwork for this revolution. Yet it was the Americans who had taken the concept to its ultimate form, through industrial discipline. British engineers visiting American bases in 1945 noted that the U.S. had made architecture mechanical. What they meant as criticism, Americans took as praise. By the late 1940s, the huts were exported to nearly every continent. They housed U.N. workers in post-war Europe, served as embassies in Africa, and even became part of early Antarctic expeditions. The same design that had sheltered tank crews in Tunisia now protected scientists at the ends of the earth. And yet, perhaps their greatest achievement was philosophical. The Quonset hut proved that in the age of total war, the ability to build faster than one could destroy was a strategic weapon in itself. It turned construction into a form of warfare, and in doing so, it quietly won the peace that followed. By the early 1950s, the Quonset hut had transcended its origins. It was no longer just a wartime innovation. It had become a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and the enduring legacy of industrial genius. Across continents, its curved silhouette stood as a quiet witness to the transformation from global war to global rebuilding. In Germany, former Wehrmacht soldiers who had once faced American power on the battlefield now worked beneath Quonset roofs, assembling cars for Volkswagen or storing aid shipments from the Marshall Plan. In Japan, the same type of huts that once housed U.S. Marines now sheltered engineers rebuilding Tokyo's infrastructure. From Norway to New Zealand, they had become part of the post-war landscape, practical, unpretentious, and indestructible. Even decades later, their influence could be felt in modern architecture and logistics. The idea of prefabricated, easily assembled structures would inspire later innovations. From Cold War radar domes and Arctic research stations to disaster relief shelters and mobile field hospitals, the DNA of the Quonset hut lived on in every modular building that followed. But perhaps what made the Quonset truly remarkable was not its design, but its philosophy. It represented a world where function triumphed over form, where the needs of the many outweighed the pride of the few. In a time when nations were rebuilding from ashes, it stood as proof that simplicity, not sophistication, could change history. An American engineer who helped design the first huts once said in an interview, years after the war, "We weren't trying to make something beautiful. We were trying to make something that worked, and it kept working." That, in essence, became the story of the 20th century. Even now, more than 80 years after their invention, thousands of Quonset huts still stand, rusted yet unbowed, scattered across old airfields, farms, and forgotten corners of military bases. Some are repurposed as workshops, museums, or community halls. Others remain untouched, ghosts of a time when victory was measured in bolts tightened and roofs raised. The Quonset hut may have begun as a temporary solution, but like so many wartime inventions, it became permanent, not just in steel and rivets, but in the very idea of what efficiency, determination, and human ingenuity can achieve. In the end, the Allies didn't just outfight their enemies, they outbuilt them. And no structure tells that story more honestly than the humble, unbreakable Quonset hut, the building that proved simplicity can win a world war.